Hello, Karen O'Loughlin here. This is going to be a tutorial in Visual C# on how to set up some unit testing. Our goal is to set up a unit test class in Visual C# using Microsoft Visual Studio, and we are going to be using Visual Studio Community 2017 for this demonstration. The resources we're using is the tutorial from Microsoft. The path is at the bottom of your screen to find that tutorial. And it's called a walkthrough creating and running unit tests for managed code. And we are using the bank account example. This is what the page looks like when you get to the docs, and a couple of comments I'll make along the way. One, it says the article is for Visual Studio 2015, but I was using 2017 and it seemed to work just fine. Also, you kind of have to learn how to read some of these tutorials. You need to read through this. It does give you some background and stuff, but if I scroll down and it talks about preparing the walkthrough, you can select that and get to that section, or you can just keep scrolling and it has the instructions here. So we're going to first open Visual Studio, and then we're going to create a new project. And then the key thing here that we want to look for is we're going to create a new class library is what we're going to do. So let's go ahead and start our Visual Studio and do that. So in Visual Studio we want to do File, New Project. And when we go to choose the project, we're doing Visual C#. And we've been used to doing Windows Forms apps, but we want to create a class library is what we want, and I chose the .NET standard. We're going to name this one our bank account, and I'm just going to call it unit test demo, so then I know what it is when I get back to it. Pay attention to where it's saved so you know where to find it again, and click OK. This is what our screen should look like once we have our project set up. And then we're going to go back to the instructions on the web to see what we do next. So then this tutorial has us, or the next thing that it tells us to do is in the new bank project is created, and we have the Solution Explorer, and there is a class1.cs file open. We saw that. And then it says in the class1 CS file is not open, double click the file so that it is open, and then we're going to copy the source code from this link. So we're going to go to the sample project for creating unit tests, and we're going to copy the source code for that. And so if I scroll down to look for the source code, it's here. It's an example of a bank account. I'm going to copy that, and then we're going to take it and put it back into our project in that file. So we've copied that code over. Just select what code is already there and replace the whole entire thing. And then if we go back and look at the instructions, it tells us to rename this. So I'll go to File, and you could do Save Class 1, and we're going to save it as Bank Account. Or you can come over here and you can rename it bank account. So I'd have to do a file save as to rename it. So I can rename it over here, and it needs to match, the class name has to match in order for that to execute. Okay. Now, next steps. If we go back to our instructions, and if we take a look, we save the file as bankaccount.cs, and it asks us to build the solution. We'll do that in just a moment. And then we are going to, you now have a project named bank. It contains the source code to test and tools to test with it. The namespace is bank account NS. It contains a public class bank account. And then they're going to talk us through the class here. So if we take a look back at our code, a couple of things. It's not a bad idea to kind of study or look through the code. We have a bank account. We have 3 instance fields. We have a default constructor with nothing in it. We have a parameterized constructor setting the name and the balance. And then the method that we're going to look at is our debit method. And they're going to step us through finding an error or a mistake in the debit method. You might be able to see it on the screen already, but that's going to be our goal. And we are specifically going to work on testing just the debit method, but you would actually want to test all methods. So you would want to test the credit method, you would want to test freezing an account, unfreezing the account. If I go back up, we would want to test the constructors. So everything that you create in terms of like a method, you could test that with a unit test. And developers will do that when they're creating new code. And there's also some companies that go back and will, even with legacy code, will create unit tests for that legacy code in order to test code that's actually already in production. It's best to do it up front to begin with, but I do know some companies that go back and write unit tests for legacy code just so they can help find errors and then keep their production process running smoother in the future. Jumping back to our tutorial, if I scroll down, this is the method we are going to specifically look at, is the debit method, and now it's going to give us instructions for creating the unit test. So we need to create a new project or add a new project, and this is where I think these instructions are not as clear as they need to be. We need to add that new project to our current project, and we're going to add a unit test project, and we're going to name it Bank Tests. So if we take a look, what I mean by adding it to our current project is we need to make sure that we right-click over here and add a new item to this, or a new project to this particular project, rather than doing File, New Project on the left from the File window. So we want to take a look at Test, and we want to create a unit test project in the .NET framework, and I believe we are supposed to name it Bank Tests. And then we click OK. That's going to populate the structure for what we call a test suite into our project. And so you can see it added some things over here. And we're now going to go back and find the code that they're going to provide for us to run this test. And we will also need to, as I'm reading through these directions, we'll need to add a reference to the bank, and we will do that when we get back. So we need a test class, and that's our bank account class. And it says to rename the class file bank account test, and that's going to ensure that we run the code that we want. But this is going to be the test method that we are going to use, and it's going to be testing a it's supposed to be there's the testing method that I want. I want to copy this code right here, and it's going to be testing the if I take a look down here, the account balance. It's going to test the debit method. So this is going to be some code that's going to set up a test. I'm going to copy that in, and it's going to set up a test to check what happens when we debit from the account. Okay, I brought the code back, and I just pasted. You know, it looked like this before I pasted it. We have a test method here, a blank one, and right below that I pasted in our new test method. We actually aren't going to use this test method right now. It just provides a template for us, so we're going to delete that out. And then I get a error message here, and if I hover over this, it gives me the message, and you'll run into this. It says type or namespace cannot be found. You are missing a using directed or an assembly reference. And remember, we were supposed to add a reference, so I'm going to right click and I'm going to add a reference. And that reference is going to be to the bank. If I go under projects, I select bank account unit test demo, or whatever we name that project, and I click OK. Then that should add our reference, and we should be able to, or hopefully that will clear the error message. It's not looking like it. And so it says I'm missing a using directive, so I maybe also need to put using bank account at the top here. Bank account NS. So I have my using directive in there now, And what we're going to try to do next then is we want to actually be able to, how do you actually run this unit test? Well, a couple of things first. Number one, this unit test is set up using the arrange, act, and assert model. And what that means, arrange is basically setting up the scenario. What scenario do we have? Well, we have a beginning balance of $11.99. We're going to debit $4.55 and we expect to get $7.44. So if I create a new bank account for Mr. Brian Walter and I set in my beginning balance of $11.99, and then my act, what I actually do or perform is I debit the $4.55 from the account here, and then I calculate the actual account balance now is account.balance. It should match. The expected and the actual should match, and so I call on a specific method called R=, and it checks to see if the expected value and the actual value are within a certain tolerance, in this case 0.001, and then it gives me a report that says account not debited correctly if it's not equal. Well, when I run this test case, it's under in the test suite. We want to open up this. We go to Test, Windows, and we want to open up the Test Explorer. The first time that you do this, it'll say build your solutions to discover all available tests. So I just click on Run All, and it should, cross our fingers, identify that we have a test for debit with valid amount. And so it'll take a moment in order to run that and see if we have the correct or if we have access to that. Okay, it ran the test and I got a red bar, which means that the test failed. I also got this clue down here that the test failed, which means my expected value and my actual value did not match. And so now I have to go back to debugging and I have to look at that method. So the debit method, if I start to look through here and I start to study the code and look to see what happened, instead of subtracting from the balance, it added to the balance. So I'm now going to correct my code and I'm going to rerun the test and see if it passes. And if my unit tests pass, then I should get a green bar where you saw the red bar. And so it'll take a moment for that test to run. And what will happen then is you can see that we only have one test and it's debit without valid, and we now have a green bar. So that test ran appropriately. What will happen then is as you try to test your other methods, for example the credit method and the freeze account or unfreeze account, etc., you will follow a similar format than to what we have here. So for example, if I copy this particular test that we did and I paste it, and let's say we want to test, instead of the debit, let's test the deposit method. So let me go back and see how that deposit method is going to be called. And it's just a credit. Instead of a debit, it's a credit. So if I go back, I'm going to rename this test because I can't have one. So I'm going to do credit with valid amount. And my beginning balance is fine. Instead of a debit amount, I'm going to rename this variable credit amount. And usually I'm just going to say that we're going to credit $20 to the account. And so my expected value, excuse me, when I get done, $11.99 plus 20, we are going to have 31.99. So my expected value is now going to be 31.99, and I need to then account, add credit amount, and we're getting close here. It still want to get the actual balance, and they are equal. My message here would be account not credited correctly if I were to run this. And so now I've got another method in my test suite. So if I come over here and I click Run All, it will run through both the debit and the credit to check both of those. So I created it so that it would run correctly, I'm hoping. If they both execute correctly, then I know that I'm good to go. But it failed. So it said credit with amounts, updates the balance, failed. I don't know why it failed. So we're going to have to go back and look at the code. So it says it threw an exception, argument was out of range, etc. So let's investigate this in just a moment and see why it failed. Okay, after taking a look at my error message, it says assert or equal failed, expected a difference no greater than 0.001 and got a large difference. And then I realized that I changed the amount I sent in here, but I did not actually call the correct method. I'm still calling the debit method. So I need to call the credit method here in order to test this. So user error, hopefully, on that part, and we run all of our error messages again to see whether or not it will pass. Cross our fingers. Actually, it will not pass because I changed my expected value when I was playing around. I had an index out of range error. So let's go back and change the fact that I wanted to deposit or credit $20 to get this expected value. And hopefully on our last run through here this will work. But as you can see, it gives you a good example of if there is any error in the expected versus the actual value, it's going to produce a mistake and you're going to have to figure out where that error occurs. So now both of my tests run correctly, so I can be kind of confident that both of those methods are running properly. To be honest though, if we take a look at those methods, we would want to use, you really often write more than one test per method. You would write maybe 4 or 5 tests for debit and 4 or 5 tests for credit. You'd want to send in various amounts. You'd want to send in maybe a negative amount. You know, it's assuming you have to that you're sending in a valid amount, so to speak, but you might want to make sure that if you send in a negative amount, that these other error messages are actually executing correctly. All right, well, that's your introduction to unit testing using Microsoft's documents. And just as one more point of reference out on the web, if you're in the class that I am teaching, there was another document that we had that gives you just an overview of unit testing, and that was this one. It's called Software Testing Fundamentals. It gives you an overview of unit testing as well. And I may do another example for you in a little bit different environment. But if we go back to our slideshow, also just to kind of review and give you a little bit of background on unit testing and why you would want to use it. The advantages to unit testing are that it helps you find the bugs early. Your development time is actually reduced because you are finding a lot of those bugs earlier on. It reduces bugs during production, and that's a huge benefit. And so much so that, as I mentioned, some companies will go back and write a unit test for legacy code because it then helps them in their production cycle when they have to go back and edit legacy code. It allows us to understand code, especially when you're debugging someone else's code. It really lets you understand the structure of the code. It provides a way to document the coding. And it also, to me, it kind of also documents the design process. If somebody designs their tests well, you can almost kind of think through the thought process that they went through. And then it's also easier to change and refactor code. All right, that's going to wrap up this video. Thanks and have a great day.